Well, this is a positive watershed moment, and that I think it is a sort of fulcrum moment in which we can, I think, from my point of view, we can look forward to unfolding the Bloody Sunday story sort of even more comprehensively. I don't believe that Bloody Sunday is over. I don't believe that inquiries into Bloody Sunday are over. I don't believe that we've had the full truth about Bloody Sunday. In fact, I know that we have not had the full truth about Bloody Sunday. And as long as that is the case, sort of, then there is a reason to keep on marching. And I also think that it's very interesting that the Bloody Sunday issue still draws huge numbers of people
Yeah.
onto the streets. Now, it was Bloody Sunday in the first place that made the civil rights movement into a real serious mass movement. Because we have to remember that the Bloody Sunday March was a civil rights march. It was a march calling for the end to imprisonment without trial. That's a basic civil rights demand. It wasn't a march for a united Ireland. It wasn't a march to defend the armed struggle, as Republicans would like us to call it. It was a march for civil rights. And if you look back at Bloody Sunday, the most striking thing about Bloody Sunday, it seems to me, is that by the time of Bloody Sunday, major civil rights demands had already been met. We had an end to the law, which permitted imprisonment without trial. We had a point system for the allocation of housing. We had a commission to redraw electoral boundaries, which had been very unfair to the Catholic nationalist community. We had that series of things, including economic things. We had a program for building houses. These were all things that we had demanded in 1968, 69, 70, 71, over and over again. There were large crowds on the streets. They were looking for these demands. There's been since the formation of Northern Ireland, there has been no period in which so much progress was made, in terms of the demands of masses of the people. And the curious thing is, and that's why there was so many thousands of people on the Bloody Sunday March to built up to that. And yet, Bloody Sunday can be seen in retrospect as the moment when the civil rights movement ended, or at least the civil rights movement as a mass movement, because who was going to come out? Some people did for a few marches, but the idea that you could march and be safe in your numbers, and if you have thousands there, so you could feel safe and you could feel it confident, and all that ended really by Bloody Sunday. So Bloody Sunday had a curiously ambivalent Janus-like effect on the history of the period, and that's quite complicated, and that's going to be quite difficult to unravel. The narrative that is frequently put forward is that you had all these that you had all these problems and all these scandals and all this injustice in Northern Ireland, and the campaign exploded and people took up arms. That is not what happened. It is very important to know that that's not what happened. And it's very important to know, because if you don't understand what happened back then, you can't understand what's happening now. Now there's a narrative being drawn now which says that the present troubles in Britain is all about a united Ireland. It's all about partition. And that has come into it. That is not what Bloody Sunday was about. The reason why so many people were... There's been no recorded occasion in history in which the mass of Catholics in Northern Ireland have supported armed struggle or other extra parliamentary ways of achieving reform. It may well be that this is wrong. It may well be that we should have had, that there should have been a mass movement based on the call for Irish unity to have been built. That was not built, and it's never been built. And there's profound lessons to be learned from that. The most profound lesson to be learned from the period of civil rights and Bloody Sunday is that what made real change, it was not the armed struggle. Nothing was achieved by the armed struggle. It's important to get that right. It's romanticised. Brave soldiers out and fighting for Ireland. I know a lot of the people who went out and fought that died were decent people, but they didn't get, and were never going to get, a return in terms of change commensurate with the investment of pain that was going to have to be put into it. So it's difficult to get these, because a lot of people have a lot of emotional involvement in it. If you've had a son or a daughter who was killed in the IRA campaign, then it's very, very difficult to accept that maybe it wasn't worthwhile. If you spent 15, 16 years in jail, then it's very, very difficult to accept people like me and say, no, that wasn't worthwhile. You know, so that was the wrong strategy from the start. So people are very reluctant, and I understand that. I feel a bit of that myself when I'm talking to people who have, you know, spent a long time in prison. And of course, an awful lot of people who spent a long time in prison are very disillusioned. They ask themselves now, why did I do that? Why did I give away 15 years of my life? I was at the launch of a book in Derry Guildhall. At the launch of a book in Derry Guildhall a couple of years back was a sort of a compilation of the little potted histories of all the children, all under 16, who had died in the north, and a little brief account of what had happened to them. And it was I've never read a book with such an emotional such emotional power as that book about the children who died sort of in the course of armed struggle. Sort of in this country. I was at the launch of that, and there's loads of people gathered, including sort of an awful lot of the families, as you can imagine, of children who had died. So it was a really heart-rending, sombre gathering, and I left it with a lad who had done 16 years in prison, a friend of mine, you know, for IRA activity. And as we left the hall and came down the stairs from the Guildhall main hall, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know, how can I talk and say, oh, what do you think of that? It's your organisation is responsible for it. And he's a good friend of mine for many years. And he said, it makes you wonder what it was all about, doesn't it? It really does. It really does. How many dead children, you know, could be to balance, you know, sort of, or to be balanced by sort of the progress that society here had made. There are big fundamental unanswered questions about Bloody Sunday and all that came afterwards. And one of the most troubling aspects, from my point of view, one of the most troubling aspects of Bloody Sunday is just this, that it seems to me now that there's a rush to write it off. A rush of people say, draw a line under it, let's move on. All those things were said, on a number of occasions between Bloody Sunday and the present day. In particular, after Lord Saville's report was published in June
2012.
Yeah, in June 2010. In 2010, when Lord Saville's report was published, there was almost a great desire, it was a great wish, and it was sort of a decent wish to get it over with. Okay, we've got all the dead declared innocent. You know, isn't that the main thing? Their families can now say there's no cloud over a loved one who was killed. Isn't that enough? Well, no, it is not enough. It is not enough. The state killed these people. It wasn't half a dozen rogue soldiers going into the bauxite down there and killing people. This is planned in advance. All the documents are there. Documents have been published. This is not speculation. The Bloody Sunday massacre was planned in advance by the British state. The British state then lied about it. The smoke hadn't cleared from Rossville Street before the lies were being pumped out to the world, authorised from the very top. We've got that in statements, you know, from British soldiers and civil servants and so on. Should we write that off? Should we forget that? Should we say at least we got the soldiers, or sort of got the soldiers who fired the shots? That's it. We call it quits? No. If people say that, oh, that's how states preserve and get, you know, they inflict atrocities on ordinary people. And then the people, Lieutenant Kelly from my lie, he was the Lieutenant Kelly was a bad bastard, you know, but he didn't do it all. And he was covered up afterwards by the man in charge in Saigon at the time, the one guy who, at the time of my lie, actually landed his helicopter and threatened the soldiers who were killing people in my lie. He threatened them with a gun, and two of his mates, they were going to stop it. He went off and complained in Saigon to the US Army headquarters, and they didn't do anything. The man he met at US Army headquarters, you've never heard this. This is how cover-up works. The guy who did this in cover-up was called Colin Powell.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Colin Powell.
Right,
whom everybody just eulogized because he's dead, so of course we rewrite history.
Yeah. So it's this is not an Irish thing or a British thing. This happens all over. Mm-hmm. What about the massacre of like hundreds of Algerians in Paris?
In Scallon.
I mean, what, you know, and everybody's forgotten about that. It was on and on and on, sort of. And they're all at it. Chechnya, it's been forgotten. Chechnya has been forgotten. There was hardly a stone left upon a stone in Chechnya, sort of after Russian troops had withdrawn. That's it. The state gets off the hook to do it again. Oh no, that's the most important thing to me, is pinning the state and getting them proclaimed to the world that this wasn't a bunch of rogue soldiers who did this to Derry and did this to our people. This was authorised by the state and covered up by the state afterwards. So, we get poor old, but Soldier F is now, there's flags of saying get Soldier F. Well, flags saying get Edward Heath, get Major General Robert Ford, get Brigadier Frank Kitson, get Defence Minister Lord Carrington. The people who are at the top of the thing, they did it. They are responsible for the massacre of Bloody Sunday, and we're not very far forward in bringing them to book, are we? There's the local media is very much sort of, well, local media is local media, isn't it? Which is the Northern Ireland people are far more progressive. The journalists are more progressive as well than they're given credit for. They really are. And sometimes when you read, because if you're a local journalist here, you have to cover the troubles. If somebody's been blown up the night before, sort of, there's a credible death threat being issued, that has to take the lead in a local paper. It has to. And that's at the expense, and it's more exciting than anything else. It's more, it's an instant, it's when somebody's shot or there's an explosion, sort of what's going on in Derry instantly becomes of wider significance, and you get Westminster and BBC and London commenting on it and covering it, and so on. So it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult for journalists. Well, I am a journalist. I know that it's difficult, except that I managed to find for myself over the years little corners, sort of, which will let me in, sort of. And then I wrote for the Belfast Telegraph. There's a unionist newspaper. I wrote every week in the Belfast Telegraph for about 10 years. On not one occasion did anybody come back to me and say, we can't print that.
What was it?
I got it. On not one occasion.
Oh,
on
not one.
And not a single occasion. And for most of that, the time, the editor was Gail Walker. Now, Gail would be known as a rather strident right-wing unionist, but she understood sort of that, and I understood why they were employing me. They wanted to have an audience or have sales outside sort of the normal Catholic nationalist bog side audience. So I was providing a service in that sense, sort of, and rather, I look at it cynically, but it was something I loved to do because it gave me an audience, sort of other than the audience which somebody like me would have been used to. I loved writing for Protestants. Well, that's pretty good. That's very crudely, but I loved doing that, sort of, and I loved people coming up to me, particularly in Belfast, and saying, I agreed with that thing you wrote last week. I didn't expect you. That's terrific. That's far better than somebody in the local union branch saying, "Yeah, you got our point across." So I did. I still like that. There's nothing makes me happier. No, we shouldn't be satisfied with an apology for David Cameron. In a strange way, the apology was part of the cover-up. David Cameron's apology was part of the cover-up of Bloody Sunday, in the sense that Savile and all the rest of the military and political chiefs of Britain all lied about Bloody Sunday. Now, when I say Savile lied, I mean that he didn't draw what seemed to me to be the proper, authentic conclusions from the evidence given to him. I'll give you an example. Lord Savile has given evidence that in the immediate aftermath of Bloody Sunday, a document was drawn up. It was drawn up by General Sir Michael Jackson, as he now is, explaining every shot that was fired. There was the soldier, there was the target. The target had a nail bomb, the rifle or whatever, and General Sir Michael Jackson had that drawn up and faxed, as it would have been in those days, I suppose, conveyed to Army headquarters in Lisburn, where it was taken by Colonel Harry Dalzell Payne, his spokesman, by 1 o'clock the next morning, just after midnight, after Bloody Sunday, the British government had already had its document out, so explaining every shot according to itself that was fired. The cover up began that quickly. And the cover up is written down, the document written down was written in his own hand. He admitted in evidence that that's my writing, covering up a bloody Sunday. Savile drew the conclusion that that there was no evidence of a cover-up. I challenge anybody in the world to read the evidence in relation to what General Sir Michael Jackson and General Ford and Colonel Loden, what these people did immediately after the shooting of Bloody Sunday. They organised the cover-up. Savile describes how a document with this cover-up information was dispatched to every every British embassy in the world as a guide to answering questions. So that's what happened in Derry, why are people killed? In other words, Savile, having detailed all this, says, his next paragraph in his report is, however, there was no evidence given of a cover-up in action or any explanation of how this could have come about. That evidence, the evidence of it, writing down a phony list of the shots fired, the evidence that was broadcast on the BBC the next morning, that information was conveyed to the House of Commons by Lord Malneal, Minister of State for the Army, immediately after. That is the cover-up. Savile describes the cover-up, then says there's no evidence of a cover-up. Work that one out. Work out that. And that the important thing about that, I say, of the fact that Savile avoided the obvious conclusion of the cover-up evidence. The important thing about it, and the most interesting thing, is that it didn't become a controversy. There was such a desire to get Bloody Sunday off the agenda. Politically, absolutely. You see, you can explain away most of the atrocities. I'm going on too long, I know that, but I'll just ramble on. You can stop a wee bit out of it.
No, it's better to have more. It's better to have more than less.
Well, what was I saying? I forget what I was saying now.
About the cover-up.
Yeah.
About Lord Savile describing a cover-up, then concluding from his own fact-finding process that there was no cover-up.
The reason why Savile's report was so widely accepted, indeed celebrated in Derry, the reason for that is that there was such a desire, and I shared it myself, to get rid of this issue. People wanted to say that we get the truth for the relatives of the dead. Surely that's enough. Surely that's enough. You know, and it wasn't enough for many of the families. Of course it was. That's what they wanted. The truth told that their sons, or husbands and fathers were innocent. And they got that from Savile. Like, good, end of. You know, politically, that's not the end of it. If we allow it to sit there, we're allowing the state to get away with mass murder. I'm not accepting and this is a political point of view. I'm not demanding that the families of the dead of Bloody Sunday agree with me on this. This is a political matter.
Yeah.
It exists irrespective of the understandable, emotional and other conclusions of those most immediately affected. When the state kills its citizens, it must be held to account. It must be held to account. Overwhelming. That is the democratic option. That's the only democratic way of pursuing this. Well, we certainly don't have the sort of a thriving society content with itself, sort of uncomfortable with the position it finds itself in. We don't have that. On the other hand, it's much better. Things today are much, much better than they were at the time of Bloody Sunday. I mean, you've an idiot not to see that. You know, it's and I think it's, I think it's what's left sort of in it really is that all the other atrocities in Northern Ireland since 1968, every atrocity since 1968 can be attributed to a hatred of one community for another. That's the trouble. Bloody Sunday can't be fitted into that narrative.
Of course not.
It can't. But the British government had a passionate desire to fit Bloody Sunday into the narrative of two hopeless communities at war with one another, and Britain having to step in to keep these two bands of sort of mad, religious, inspired people apart and to try to find a settlement for them. That's not an accurate narrative. That's not an accurate story of what happened in Northern Ireland. Again, it lets the Brits off the hook. That's why Bloody Sunday is important to the British state, far more important Bloody Sunday is more important to the British ruling class, than anything else would have happened, because Bloody Sunday which exposed the role of the British state here in Northern Ireland in a way that nothing else did. They murder innocent people, then they lie about it, then they cover up the lies, then they look for ways to sell their lies as common sense and a decent compromise and so forth. It's ever been so. It's ever been so. This is what the Romans did after they massacred half the people of Gaul. They didn't come back and say we massacred. Of course not. Julius Caesar come back and says, well, we met these fascinating savages. He uses the phrase, Julius Caesar's account of his passage, which he wrote going through Gaul and so on. If you read that and then read some of the statements by British senior officers about the bog side, it's exactly the same. And that phrase about some fascinating savages. It's there's one statement by one of the senior British officers which begins, "Fleet of foot and full of guile, the bogside hooligan is a formidable enemy." Now there's somebody who's fascinated by the sort of otherness of these people in the bogside, and it's written like that's a Latin sentence. Fleet of foot and full of guile, so it's lovely rhythm to it as well. Imperialists have been saying that on the return from war everywhere. We met these people, wow, strange people, wild, many admirable qualities. What they said about the Native Americans, very very good. It's just the same stuff. It's all the same stuff. It's always the same stuff. When you ask, is this the only way forward to Northern Ireland? It depends on your point of view. It depends on your perspective. Now, I think it was seen the way forward in terms of mass mobilisation, of thousands and tens of thousands of people coming out onto the streets and discovering their power. You don't discover your power by cheering on people with guns and saying that you're our side. You don't discover your power by winning a vote in Parliament. You discover your power by winning things for yourself, and thousands of people march out, with one objective in mind: sharing. It's that sharing is to come along the streets, and indeed it's the people coming together in large numbers which gives you the connection between what's happening in Derry and what happened in Memphis and what happens everywhere where people rise up, sort of all the revolutions in Eastern Europe and so on. One of the key aspects of it all is that you can't be free unless you take freedom yourself. You can't, if nobody else can give you freedom. If your freedom is in my gift, you're not free. It's only when you go out and do it. Marx called this the sloughing off of the muck of ages in a revolutionary moment. And you suddenly realise there's a wonderful little paragraph in John Reed's American journalist's account of the 1917 revolution, of coming across the Neva, the river in Petrograd. The troika, 3 horses and a buggy. It says the guy driving it, who would have been the equivalent of a taxi driver, I suppose, has suddenly stood up and said, "Look, Petrograd, all mine now." No, it didn't mean mine personally. It meant us. We achieved this. We achieved this. Look what we've done. We've freed ourselves. That's a heady thing to happen to anybody. And that's the moment of freedom. That's the moment of freedom. That's not when somebody runs down one flag and puts up another flag. And that's not it. That's not it at all. It's not when your army defeats another army. No, look, you cheer on your own army. But the army is not the people. Sorters, people start the letters in Belfast some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and that was in the Schenkel Road. All the people in the office walked out when a guy was sacked. The guy was sacked for allegedly collecting phone numbers of targets for loyalist paramilitary groups. He denied it totally, said that's not what he was doing. He was sacked on the spot. All the workers on the Schenkel Road depot immediately walked out. Within 2 hours, all the workers in the Falls Road sorting depot, the Katy, had also worked out. So you got right from the start. You had the thing of everybody together, we are not allowing this guy to be sacked. And they won their case. The sacking was withdrawn. But in the middle of all that, I went up to Belfast. I was on the national executive of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions at the time. And I went up to Belfast, and there was a rally in the city centre, and they asked me to speak at it. So I spoke at it, sort of, and people seemed to appreciate or approve of what I said. And the meeting went so well that we had a march, which was unscheduled, therefore illegal and so on. We marched up the Schenkel Road, which is the heartland of loyalism, through what we called the Lanark Way Peace Line, and back down the Falls Road. Now, the Lanark Way Peace Line is notorious for the absolute cockpit of sectarian a rivalry and violence in Northern Ireland. When we reached the top of the Schenkel and went through the Lanark Way thing, we held a meeting just with the gates closed between the Catholic and Protestant areas, and everybody came from the Catholic side and the Protestant side. I made a very good meeting, ranting and raving and so on. And I enjoyed it enormously. But here, okay, on the way up the Schenkel Road, marching up the Schenkel, something I wouldn't have dared to do for 40 years previously. I'm marching up, and then because I'm one of the speakers, I'm at the front of the line, I'm on the front line. On 2 occasions, as we walked up Schenkel, people came out from the pavement onto the road and said the same thing they said to me. You're very welcome on the Schenkel Road, Mr. McCann. I always remember the Mr.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a big one.
I asked myself, how else could this have happened? Here am I from the bogside. In what other context could this happen? And that, to me, illustrated the truth was that the antidote, or the opposite of sectarian division, is not people just deciding to like one another. It's not a moral decision that people make. It's when there's a material reason for them to come together in some other, on the basis of some other opinion or consciousness other than communal division. It took that moment to do that. And of course the moment disappeared, the moment faded away. But it happened not because of preaching. It happened not because of somebody convincing somebody else of their political ideas. It happened naturally because what they were involved in, that it was something that had nothing whatever to do with the community you came from. That's how sectarianism is going to be solved. Historically, the only occasions in which Catholic and Protestant people have come together in large numbers to link arms and demand a single thing under a single slogan. The only occasions have been class struggle. The only occasions have been sort of when people took on old-fashioned, and that's why those things are so heavily sort of populated, those events sort of by trade unions. It's not that trade unions are beyond criticism, but it's I draw profound lessons from that when people talk about anti-sectarianism and let's move on. I say that was moving on. We moved on there and slipped back because that issue didn't have the momentum in Northern Ireland to carry forward, sort of, and accelerate, sort of, and get a grip. And so, sort of, everything in 1919. Let's jump back a bit. In 1919, if you were to ask any Irish historian, try this like a fantasy story, you ask them, what happened in Ireland in January 1919? Now, people who understand Republican history, or historians and so on, will come and say that what happened was that the Irish War of Independence began in a village called Solohead Bog in Tipperary. There was a couple of IRA people, Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, so they killed 2 policemen. That was the War of Independence underway. Generally agreed among all historians. That was the starting pistol for the War of Independence. Now, what actually happened in 19? The biggest thing that was happening in January 19 in Ireland was not a shooting in Tipperary. It was the fact that Belfast was under martial law. Right. And the reason Belfast was under martial law had to do with part of the great upsurge of demands for the 44-hour week. It was the same demand which had been made in Glasgow. It's become known as Red Clydeside in Glasgow, that period. Liverpool, as part of the post-World War I upsurge of militancy right across Europe, Belfast was fully involved in that. And I say, Belfast stayed out longer than Red Clydeside. They had gone back to work and so on to get there. That's erased from our history because other things take over and so on, and there's no context in which to Do you understand it? So, anyway, what I mean is sort of a rising class struggle. There's nothing wrong with Northern Ireland that a good general strike wouldn't put right. Yeah. So there you go. No, I do think that that there will be, although I don't know when, a radical transformation of society in Northern Ireland. I do believe that we'll reach a day, hopefully very soon, when people will understand that we'll do no harm if Catholic and Protestant children are learning multiplication tables in the same room. You know, it's and that will come. You see, and one of the curious paradoxes of Northern Ireland is that despite all the communal hatred and the fact that there's political gridlock because they can't satisfy both sides, both communities at once. Despite all that, there's a huge hunger for people to come together. You see it all the time. At the drop of a hat, if there is an issue in which people come together, they do. I mean, that's something very simple. You know, I spoke at a meeting some years ago outside Belfast City Hall to 25,000 people about the health service and Tory attacks on the health service. Now, by definition, you look down from the platform outside the City Hall, you can't tell if you're Catholics or Protestants. And the important thing is that whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant in that context, at that moment, simply doesn't matter. And I think that's true of, you know, when people are fighting for economic rights. It's true sort of when women come together to fight for women's rights. We have sort of a campaign that's going out, organised by women in this city, for example. Alliance for Choice Derry has made a big difference. And it draws women together. If you go to something organised by Alliance for Choice, you know, when men are allowed in, when you go, clearly you can't tell. You can sit in a 2-hour meeting and you can't tell who are the Protestants and who are the Catholics. It's not relevant when you're fighting for women's rights. It's not relevant when you're fighting for a workers' rights. And therefore I see the fight for social justice and economic justice and justice for women as being the most important thing that will transform everything. History may well record that the most significant change brought about by marching in Northern Ireland in the last centuries was not the gains made through the civil rights movement, but the gains made by women. And because it was absolutely evident that in the women's movement, north and south, and campaigners, that they were doing it themselves. They're all young women, 16, 17, 18, 19, in their 20s and so forth. Out march. That's new in Northern Ireland, and gender didn't matter a hoot. You know, it's so there's the solution to problems of sectarianism. It's staring us in the face. You know, it's but of course, if that's the solution you recommend, then a number of things follow from it. You have to fight for women's rights. You can't take that attitude and say, no, but not abortion. You know, that's a little bit too far. You know, or you can't fight for economic justice for Catholic and Protestant workers, or the transformation of the health service into what it was supposed to be. You can't fight for those things on the basis of our community versus yours. Yeah. You can't. You know, it's so once we get onto that agenda, I think you begin, and you can see it. You can see it in sort of trade union work and so on. You can see, you know, sort of at particular moments, the sectarian assumptions sort of melt away. You know, it was always there. My father remembers he was in Derry Trades Council, which I was many years later, the trade union council in the town, and it was Catholics and Protestants, and why wouldn't there be the trade union movement? Although that, my father can remember the chairman of his union branch, electrician union, when somebody said something, and the chairman said, "But worshipful master." Oh, that's the Orange Charter. You know. He forgot himself, you know. Oh, no, that's right. You know. But it was there. But this guy was a good trade unionist. You know, so there's all those contradictions sort of going on. Northern Ireland's a more interesting place than it's given credit for. It really is, you know. It's
I think so too.
Anyway, that's you may have learned by now to ask me a simple question. What gives me hope sort of is, basically, at my age, this sounds a bit patronising, but what gives me hope sort of is younger people. I mean teenagers and so on. And what gives me most hope of all is the young women of Ireland who have campaigned over the last number of years and done things which were impossible. Who would have believed that the Republic of Ireland would be the first country in the world to legalise abortion through mass referendum. Who would have believed that?
Yes.
You see, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened because 1 and 2 women, 5 women, and it's called, there was an incident, it's what, 10, 15 years ago now, I think, when there was a young woman needed an abortion. She was only 14, she'd been raped. And,
Case X.
Case X. Now, and the Case X, when I finally realised that this was potentially revolutionary, when I read about a school in Waterford or Wexford, wherever it was, and there was a demonstration in the centre of town saying release Miss X or Lord Gordy of the abortion, and whole classes of girls at a school and refused permission by Case X, climbed out through the windows. There were some brilliant pictures of that. Climbed out through the windows. He's a 14, 15-year-old girl. Wow! now we're talking. Now we're sucking diesel.
That is the best way to end this. Amazing. Perfect. Alright, it's your turn.